One thing China has proven is that they have some of the most lax controls on chemical plants, manufacturing, you name it. Foxconn with suicide nets, forced abortions. Their rivers routinely catch on fire. We have completely clean coal power plants in the United States and Canada that put out nothing but water vapor and carbon dioxide. That's why they passed laws to tax those. Well, they didn't pass laws. Obama just said so and taxes them and regulates them to, quote, bankrupt them in his words. But China builds multiple new plants a week with no controls, no scrubbers, just a plant, water turbines, and the stacks. Well, London Guardian reports China warned over insane plans for new nuclear power plants. I mentioned how 300-plus containment areas of TEPCO believes may start blowing up at Fukushima. Again, I've never been against nuclear power, except these corporations don't run these things properly and don't retire plants. I mean, they run these plants like you'd run your frat house. There's like beer bottles laying around, except they're radioactive. China warned. He Zhongyu, I think you pronounce it, a leading Chinese scientist, says the country is not investing enough in safety controls after lifting the post-Fukushima disaster reactor ban. And it goes on, he ran the country's nuclear weapons programs, you name it, and says that they're going to build scores of these plants basically on the same type of designs the U.S. had 40 years ago. I mean, this is a disaster in the making. Go read the London Guardian investigative report. And I only mention that because it shows the above-the-law nature of governments. Take the Clintons. Hundreds of millions of dollars the last decade of charity money they kept for private jets and mansions and foreign dictators giving them money. London Guardian, again, is reporting on this. So is Associated Press. Clinton Foundation donors got weapons deals from Hillary Clinton's State Department. So you give money to Hillary Clinton, and then she says we can give weapons to this country, billions of dollars. I mean, just unprecedented corruption because they're getting away with it. Now, Harry Dent's been coming on the show, I don't know, 5 years or so, and he's a best-selling author, made a lot of big predictions in the 80s and 90s, was one of the top guys at Maine Capital. He's a routine guest. Folks know who he is. HarryDentResearch.com, HarryDent.com/Alex Jones to find some specials and deals on his books that he's kind enough to offer our listeners. But I wanted to get him on because he's the author of The Demographic Cliff and the editor of the free newsletter Economy and Markets. And I won't go over his whole bio and where he's worked and what he's done. Folks know he's a prestigious guy. But he did accurately predict that we would see starting last year global depressionary curves. And we're now seeing that. But you've got the QE Unlimited and the race to the bottom, so you've got inflation in luxury goods and some other areas. So it's almost a perfect storm, at least what I'm seeing in Austin, where stuff does cost more money, but at the same time, there is a depression in all the businesses I know people have and in talk radio and everything. I mean, it's demographic. I guess the only growth area is going to be in medicine and stuff like that. So we've seen a lot of developments now where they admit the economy is growing at 0.2. That's with Cook numbers. Ron Paul agreed with me that we're probably shrinking at 2 to 3%. That's a depression. So I wanted to get Mr. Dent on to give us his global view on the state of the world and where we are planetary, on a planetary scale, but also in a regional scale, and what things like TPP and these unelected boards having more and more control mean, what it means when corruption seems to be at all-time highs and there's no enforcement, but the very Justice Department that won't go after Hillary is going after the global soccer league. I mean, it just seems like a train wreck. They won't regulate properly nuclear power plants, but they'll harass bigwigs in soccer. It seems like the Tea Party from Alice in Wonderland. Harry Dent, Research.com. Harry Dent, that's kind of a gestalt I threw out there. What do you want to tackle first?
Well, Alex, I'll just start with, we've been saying that this year the economy would be weaker than forecast. Economists just extrapolate past trends in the future and say, oh, we're about to reach escape velocity. We look at demographics. Demographics told us in the late 80s that Japan was going to collapse. It tells us that Germany is going to be the worst hit single country in the next decade, and nobody expects that. It says that the affluent in the United States, who are the last part of our economy still spending because they go to school later, their kids go to school later, they peak in spending later, they're getting ready to drop off, especially in 2015 forward. So everybody's looking for this, endless QE to turn into something when, first of all, it's something for nothing. I don't know how anybody gets that you could create money out of thin air, trillions of dollars, and solve any real problems. All you do is keep the bubble going that government started in the 80s and 90s. And the more the bubble goes, when it finally bursts, it's going to be more painful for everybody. And China, you were talking about China earlier. I've said over and over again, U.S. doesn't even know what a bubble is compared to what China's done, because China's government has had the most control and impact over their economy. They have overbuilt condos and housing, 27%, industrial capacity, 30, 40, 50%, all other types of infrastructures. They've moved 250 million people in the last 12 years, no skills, from rural areas, and they just haven't built stuff for nobody. They're building all these empty condos in cities, in ghost cities and stuff. So China's the biggest bubble. And what I'm seeing as an update, Alex, from last time I was on is, the markets are finally kind of getting in a confused state. They've just been up with all this free money coming in and pumping them up. There's nowhere else for investors to go. But starting in December of last year, they've gone sideways. And the reason is there is a disconnect between the economy in the U.S. and what stocks are assuming. Earnings are slowing. Retail sales have slowed dramatically.
And by the way, I've got to interrupt you and hand it to you. I wish I had the staff to do it. I have a great crew, but they're always too busy on breaking news. You were on a year ago, 6 months ago. You literally said by the middle of next year, it'll be clear that the growth is dead. It'll be clear that it's stagnating. It'll be clear that we're not hitting escape velocity. We had almost all the other economists saying the opposite. So I wish your crew would go back to those interviews and get the clips out. We'd play them next time you came on, because you really are making accurate predictions here.
Yeah, and again, we've just got good, simple tools. We're not doing anything magic or complicated. We know from cradle to grave when people spend money on everything, when they enter the workforce, become workers and consumers, when they buy their first house, their largest house, their first car, their luxury car, when they spend money on childcare, camping equipment, even potato chips. So what we do is not a mystery. We look at the predictable things people do as they age from the macro. I've got a graph you guys have. It's called the spending wave. It just moves forward the birth index in the United States, especially for the large baby boom generation, 46 years. That's when the average person spends the most money in their entire life. And you can see all the way back to the 50s how close a correlation with the economy. And you can predict this. We can project out, as you can see in this graph, almost 5 decades. But note the red line here presently. Because of quantitative easing in response to the slowing of baby boom spending from 2008 forward, something we predicted decades before, and the same we predicted for the collapse in Japan tonight. The stock market has just gone ballistic, way off the fundamentals. The market's just going up because investors are buying it. That's with free money from the Fed, and there's nowhere else to go with investment. So there's a huge disconnect.
And so the real economy is stalling in the disconnect. So the folks that are heavily in stocks are still euphoric, but there is a feeling, as I said, of wonderland. Am I right to say when it's artificial, when it crashes, it'll be that much worse?
Yeah, you can see from that graph, we've never diverged this much. So the next crash will be much worse than the last one. The last one was substantial. I call this, Alex, the market on crack. The market, just like a person on crack, you're not going to make good decisions. People on crack think things jump off a roof and fly. That's where the stock market's at. But again, I'll tell you where it's worse, in China. China's been slowing. Their real estate, which we've been predicting for a long time, finally going down, slowly at first. But their economy keeps slowing. But guess what? Their stock market's gone up almost 150% in the last year. In other words, their economy's clearly slowing and their market's going up. The reason for this is the Chinese, who've been speculating in real estate more than any investors in the world. They're huge savers. They love real estate. Now that real estate's going down, they've all of a sudden switched over to speculating in stocks, something they don't even normally do. So their stock market is in a huge disconnect. So we're setting up, I think, in the next few months and most, for the markets to finally get this disconnect, and we see a crash that the Federal Reserve and central banks can't just solve with more money. I tell you, if real estate in China starts going down, like I think it's going to go down in the next year or two, the wealthy there have so much in that. There's no amount of stimulus the Chinese government or the U.S. government can do to counteract that.
Let me ask you this question. What will a Chinese implosion then, as a guesstimation or dead reckoning, look like, and how will it affect the rest of the world economy?
Well, first of all, now they've drawn their everyday investors into stocks in addition to real estate. So they got two major bubbles to burst. And China's was the greatest bubble to burst last time around. It'll be greater this time. So their economy implodes. Their economy has more income inequality even than the U.S. does. We lead the Western world in this. The top 10% of Chinese households control 60% of the income and consumer spending. They own almost all the real estate. So when real estate implodes, their wealth will implode. When their wealth implodes, they will stop spending. They will stop buying real estate. And not just in China. I'm just getting ready to do a report for our newsletter coming up, where we look at how the Chinese, the wealthy Chinese, are fleeing in droves. The Chinese government does not allow you to take more.
That was my next question. Stay there. Amazing that you brought that up next. I wanted to get to this article at Infowars.com. Wealthy installing safe rooms to prepare for civil unrest. The Guardian reports world elites are racing to secluded rural redoubts. What is going on? Stay there, Mr. Dent. We'll be back. I'm not selling Harry Dent's books. I actually should on the online bookstore, InfoWarsStore.com. That's how we fund our operation. I certainly read his books and make a lot of decisions, based on the research, along with other research I do. And the show's research. We have a lot of great guests on different angles. So basically, we're completely transparent. You just see my whole thinking process here. He just wants to offer the listener something amazing. He's a New York Times bestselling author, and he's got the new book out, The Demographic Cliff, that is a bestseller. He's offering the book free today. I'll plug this again in the next segment for him. Free to our listeners. And it's not like these deals you hear where they go, we'll send you free prostate pills, but shipping's $14. The shipping is $4.95. I happen to know what it cost. Probably $3-4 if it's media mail to actually ship it, and then $2 for the shipping company. I think this is at cost. This is or maybe losing money. This is a true free book deal. And it's a very powerful book. Anyone that cares about their future should read it. It's something you should give city council people, Congress folks. People need to understand this. The elite understand it. They're making preparations. We're not. You can go to harrydentbook.com to find that special. harrydentbook, HARRYDNT book.com, harrydentbook.com. We'll talk about it before he leaves us. This is a short segment, Harry. I want to get back to the big question here. I know a lot of people worth $500 million, $100 million, $1 billion, $4 billion, $10 billion. I live here in Austin. A lot of them live here. And I know some in New York and some out in California. They've all been freaked out for a decade. But the last 5 years, they've been really moving into rural areas. They've been leaving to New Zealand. They have been getting out of the country. And when I first talked about this, folks said, no, they're not leaving because of a collapse. You're being a fearmonger. Really? I talked to folks that knew James Cameron, and when he left, I'd already been told he was leaving to New Zealand. Permanently leaving. Okay? So you need to understand something. The elite every billionaire has left Israel the last 6 years. They've moved to Switzerland and London and places like that. So I'm kind of taking up the segment here, ranting. We got an article about elites building safe rooms, bunkers, armored redoubts. Mr. Dent, what is going on with this?
Well, the smart money always acts first, and no place more than China. The wealthy in China are leaving in droves, and what they're doing, since their government says you can only take $50,000 out a year, they said, oh, we're not leaving, we're just moving to Irvine, California, or New York City, or Boston, or somewhere, or London, or Melbourne, Australia. We're just going to get our kids in a good college for a few years. We'll be back. And oh, by the way, while we're there, we got to buy a place. So they buy the most expensive house or condominium they can because they're laundering money. They're getting their money out of the country so that when things do fall apart, because they know the Chinese bubble can't last.
Listen, you go to a nice restaurant in Austin, or I've been with folks out on a fancy golf course. It's rich Chinese everywhere. I mean, they're just evacuating. I'm sorry, I'm ranting.
Well, but this happened in the late 80s when Japanese had the big bubble in real estate. They were making obscene profits, and they were using those profits to go buy